Hi and welcome to this tutorial on Hibernate. In the past few tutorials, we have looked at annotations in considerable detail. We have seen how to annotate individual entity classes. We've seen how to annotate the relationships between different entities and, of course, relationships between entities and value types as well. And we've also seen how to annotate inheritance mapping. So in this tutorial, we're going to look at a simple CRUD operation of a single entity. So as far as annotations are concerned, if you've been following along, you should have enough information to write any application and map any relationship using annotations. There are a few annotations other than what I've covered. It would not be possible for me to go through all the annotations and cover all of them, but the tutorials that we've already seen should get you going on writing annotations. And of course the reference manual on the Hibernate website should answer any other questions you have on annotations. Now, moving on, as I said, in this tutorial, we're going to do a simple CRUD operation. So I will have a user details object here. I have actually removed all the other, the relationships and all those things. Again, I want to keep things very simple. I just have a generated ID and a username. So that's all there is to it. Okay, so this is my user details object, and of course I have defined a table. This is also not required. Let me remove this. So it's as simple as it can get. So I have entity annotation, and I have this ID, which is a generated value, and I have a name with getters and setters for both the ID and the name. Now let's run some code to let's write some code and run it, which saves a user detail object, and fetches a user detail object, makes some changes to the user detail object, and then finally deletes the user detail object, and see how it maps to create, update, and delete for a database record. Now we have seen how to create records earlier when we did a session.save in order to create records, and we also did a session.get in our previous tutorials in which we got records from the database given a particular key, the primary key. Now let's look at the update and delete as well in this tutorial. So here I have my main method, which is doing the basics here again. It has a session factory initialized, and it's getting a session from the session factory. It's beginning a transaction, and then here is where all our operations go, whether we want to do a create, update, or a delete. And then finally we do a transaction.commit and a session.close. Okay, so now let's do a create first. So I'll create a few user objects. I'll say user details, user equals new user details. So the idea is to have a few records available in the database. So one thing I can do is add it in a loop so that we can have a few set of records. Okay, so I'll be having a set of 10 records. Over here. Okay, so the ID will be auto-generated here. All I have to do is set the name. So I'll say user dot set username. So it'll just create with the value I, so it'll be user 1, user 2, and so on. So of course start with 0, so it'll be user 0, user 1, and so on. Now I have 10 such objects available here. So all I need to do is I need to do a session.save for each of these objects. So I will put this loop inside the transaction here, so that I can access a session. I cannot do it over here because I haven't opened the session yet. So here what I'll do is, once I've set the username, I will do a session dot save of user, and then I close the transaction and I close the session. Okay, so if everything goes well, we should have 10 users in the user details table. And of course here I have set the HBM to DTL as create, so it's going to create the schema. Now let's run this. Okay, so you see here there are so many inserts happening. Now let's user details, and it will give us this list of users, user 0 to user 9, which is fine. So this is the C of CRUD. You can create objects by using the session.save, and you create new objects here, which of course are of a class which has been marked as an entity. Okay, so now that the create is done, let's see how to fetch it. So let me remove this now that we have the tables and the data. I don't need to create it. Now let me fetch the data here. So I will do a session dot get. Now I need to specify two arguments here. We've already seen this, but just to recap, in order to get any object from the database, I need to specify two arguments. One is the class of the object that we're trying to get. Here it's a user details class, so I need to specify user details dot class, and the second argument is the primary key. Now here, if I just specify the user details class, it knows what table it needs to pull up the data from, but you have so many records in this table. Now I need to isolate one particular record. I need to tell Hibernate, hey, get me this record. So I need to specify the key. So here this is the key value that I need to specify, which is in the user ID. So I will specify the value, let's say 6. Okay, now I will assign this to a user details object. User details user equals, and of course the session.get returns me a type object, so I will have to cast this. Again, note that I'm not doing any error handling here because it's a simple example. So let's go with it for now. So I'll do a system.out. I'll say username this user dot get username. I have to put the plus sign here. I missed that. Okay, so now let's run this. But before we run this, what I'll do is here, instead of a create, I will do an update. The reason I'm doing this is I don't want the list of users that I'd inserted earlier to go away. Now if I do a create here, what it's going to do is it's going to drop the entire schema and it's going to recreate it, and all the user values that I had inserted earlier will go away. So now if I do an update, it's not going to drop the schema, so these values are going to remain, and then I can also retrieve the value. So I can retrieve the value with an ID of 6. So now let's run this. So there you go. Here we have a select query that's getting run because I'm doing a session.get here, and I'm passing this, the primary key as 6. So it's going to, run this query where the user details table dot user ID equals 6. So this is going to give us the user file here, this one. So I get a user object, and then I can use this user object in my code. I have used it to print the get username, and then it's printed out user 5, which works perfectly. Okay, now here you need to note that I can actually take this these couple of lines of code, and of course this one alone. I cannot do a session.get outside this, but I can access the user object outside the session. So here's what it is. Earlier, the system.out.print was over here. It was in between these two lines of code. The session was still open, but now here I have closed the session. In spite of closing the session, I can still access the user because the first level data is being pulled up. We've already learned what a proxy object is and how it pulls up data dynamically. There is no list here, there's no collection object. So since it's just a username, it's a first level record, and it's going to pull that up by default. It's going to be an eager fetch for the first level. It's not going to be lazy, so I can access the property even after closing the session. So just to test that out, let's run this one more time. There you go. It still comes up with the user because user 5 would have already been populated in this user object when you do a session.get. Okay, so this forms the R of the CRUD. You are able to read the objects depending on the primary key. Now, before we do the update part, let's try doing a delete first because it's the simpler of the two. In order to delete any object, I need to do a let's do this. Now let's try to remove this, this user 5 object itself. So in order to delete any object, what I need to do is I need to call session.delete. The session.delete takes an object as a parameter, and the object is the object that you want to delete. So it involves two steps now. You see, here you have to first pull up the object. And here we have pulled up an object with ID 6. So I can delete this object itself. And of course, you don't have to actually pull up the object every time. Say you have an object in memory that you're working on and you want to delete that, then you would just pass that object to a session.delete. And what the session.delete does is it finds out what this object is, and of course it identifies it by the primary key, and then it deletes that record in the database which corresponds to this user object. Of course, I'll have to remove this system.out.print because this user object is no longer going to be there. Okay, so now let's run this. Of course, before running, let's query this one more time. You see, primary key 6, user 5 is available. Now, once I run this, it first does a select and it gets the object, and then it does a delete. So our session.delete is actually doing a delete command. It says delete from user details where user ID equals. Again, it's identifying the object by the primary key. Now if you run this, you can see ID 6, user 5 is not there anymore. Okay, so this forms the D of CRUD. You can delete objects by using the session.delete. Now let's have a look at how to do an update. Now I have this user object here. Now I want to change the user name. So once I've pulled up the user object, I can update the properties of this user object. Let's say set username. I'll call this updated user. Of course, this will not get me anything because primary key 6 has already been removed. So let me try 5. Okay, so now I will set this as set username as updated user, and now what I'll do is I'll do a session dot update. Now the session dot update also takes an object, and I will pass the user object here, and that's it. Now again, to verify, primary key 5 has the value user 4. Now if I run this, here you can see it does an update query after doing a select. Now if I execute this, here you can see the primary key 5 has the updated property as the updated user. So this forms the U of CRUD. So now we've seen how to create an object, how to read an object, how to update it, and how to delete it. So this is one of the most simplest ways to do a CRUD operation in Hibernate by using the session object methods in order to operate on the objects. Now, in the subsequent tutorials, we're going to look at a few more advanced options for fetching objects and then updating them. So see you in the next tutorials.